Today I'm in El Palo Alto City Park in the California city that bears that same name, Palo Alto. And just up ahead of me on the trail is California State Historical Landmark number 2. It's not a building, it's not an archaeological ruin, it's not even a geological feature, although it is one of California's oldest historical landmarks. Moreover, it's alive. Many of you will have already understood that El Palo Alto is a tree. In fact, a tall tree. It's a coast redwood tree. And here it is, behind me. The story of El Palo Alto and how it became a California State Historic Landmark has a lot to teach us about both the history of California as well as how that history has been imagined and written over the years. One obvious feature of El Palo Alto is the way that it signals to us the history of Spanish colonial presence in California and also the lasting impact of that presence here in the Golden State. El Palo Alto sits at the edge of San Francisquito Creek, which runs from the Santa Cruz Mountains 20 miles or so to San Francisco Bay. And El Palo Alto probably washed down as a seed from those Santa Cruz Mountains and took root here on the edge of the bay or close to the bay in a place that redwood trees typically don't grow. And so it was a landmark in a flat landscape that became a marker for the Spaniards when they first arrived. The Portola expedition camped close to this tree in 1769 when they were lost and seeking a way around the San Francisco Bay on their way back to San Diego after failing to find the Monterey Bay. The Palo Alto featured on early Spanish maps of the area as well. And it ultimately became a marker for a dividing line in early California. The lands to the north of San Francisquito Creek, to the north of El Palo Alto, would become property of the San Francisco Mission, Mission Dolores. The lands to the south would become the property of the Santa Clara Mission at San Jose. And that administrative boundary remains in the landscape today because I'm in Santa Clara County, but if I walk across the bridge just to the north, that would put me into San Mateo County. And so this lasting Spanish presence is here, and we can find it in a place like Palo Alto, but we can also find this in many parts of California where administrative boundaries and lines drawn on maps in the 18th century continue to have a meaning in modern California. One other pretty obvious legacy of Spanish colonization on the landscape of California is, of course, in the names on the map. The Spanish language, which demarks out those places that were meaningful to the Spaniards, of course, illustrates their effort not just to take possession of this place militarily and spiritually and in a labor and economic sense, but also to conquer it linguistically, to mark it out as theirs. And they renamed places on the map that were meaningful to them, places that had obviously names in the many local languages of the peoples that the Spaniards encountered. But so here in the Bay Area, of course, they're not just major cities and settlements, the mission towns of San Jose and San Francisco or Santa Cruz, but also the creeks, mountains, major thoroughfares between those missions and the ranches. And so names like Pescadero, San Gregorio, Pilarcito, Sanchez Creek, and Alameda de las Pulgas and many other features of the landscape tell us about the places that were meaningful to Spanish colonization. And I think it's really interesting too to take a look at the map of California, maybe in the context of this class, and to look for those places that have Spanish names, the old Spanish names, which reflect the limits and the imprint of the Spaniards in this part of in coastal California. Second important question to ask is why El Palo Alto was selected as a California State Historical Landmark in the first place. And for that we have to look back to the early 20th century when Anglo-Californians here and places like Palo Alto and elsewhere were casting about for a usable past, a history to connect their own stories to. And in that quest they settled upon Spanish colonial history, a European colonial story that would become the beginning point for their own stories and histories in the Golden State. The landmark plaque that sits at the base of the tree offers a few clues to that perspective, because we can see here a story written down in 1926 on a brass plaque placed by the native sons of the Golden West, an Anglo-historical society established in the early 20th century. The plaque reads in part, "Under this giant redwood, the Palo Alto, November of 1769, camped Portola and his band on the expedition that discovered San Francisco Bay. It was his assembling point for their reconnoitering parties. Here in 1774, Padre Palau erected a cross to mark the site of a proposed mission, which was later built at Santa Clara," etc. And so here we can see a process of recalling history and writing history, which connected contemporary residents of Palo Alto to a deeper history of European settlement and colonization in California. The 19th and 20th century histories of this place were not kind to El Palo Alto. They built a railroad track literally across its route line in the 1870s. You can see the bridge and the train traffic that runs next to it even today. Just below it, San Francisco Creek has been deeply eroded by the paving of its watershed and development activities up the stream. And over time, the tree has experienced fire and damage, eventually losing one of its two major trunks that existed in the 18th century when Spanish conquistadors arrived and first drew maps of the tree. Nonetheless, here it is, a 1,000-year-old living emblem of the history of this place, and in fact, the many histories of this place and the many meanings that have been ascribed to it over time.
The history of El Palo Alto should remind us that the history of California begins with the land and the people who have occupied it over many, many generations. Long before El Palo Alto became a symbol for Spanish conquistadors and explorers and missionaries in California, it was a place in the landscape of the Mukwekmi Ohlone people who lived here for literally thousands of years. The Ohlone people lived along the banks of San Francisco Creek. They harvested the bark from trees like Palo Alto for their shelter. They fished in the creek and hunted for rabbits and deer and other creatures, otter in the bay. And they lived in settled villages here, and they shaped the landscape as we know. And El Palo Alto was part of that landscape, and as a lasting feature of this place for over 1,000 years, it should remind us of the deep connections not just to the land in California, but to the people who lived on that land, who are our forebears in this place.